So our next speaker is Carmen Chung. Carmen is a software engineer, writer, and a conference speaker with a reputation for breaking other people's code. Prior to her move into tech, she worked internationally as a corporate lawyer for almost 7 years. During the day, she's a software engineer at Valiant Finance, and at night, she's the host and producer of a YouTube channel called CodeFights, which teaches people how to solve coding questions in 15 minutes. She was also recently selected as a finalist in the Rising Technologist category of the 2020 Tech Playmaker Awards. In her spare time, she teaches flexibility classes, creates often absurd side projects, and fosters rescue dogs, currently mostly greyhounds, which, despite being fast, total couch potatoes, they're like my spirit animal. Anyway, please put your hands together and welcome Carmen.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Caitlin, and thank you to RubyConf Australia for having me here. It's such an honor to be on stage. So today we're going to be talking about how to write tech documentation that will save your career. And I know what you're thinking. That sounds pretty over-exaggerated. But I'm going to take you back in time, specifically to 2018, when a junior software developer with the username CSCareerThrowaway567 posted this on Reddit. Accidentally destroyed production database on first day of a job, was told to leave, and on top of this, I was told by the CTO that they need to get legal involved. How screwed am I? Now, I want you to remember this headline because we're going to be coming back to what exactly happened in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to introduce you to the newest member of Big Tech Co. This is Kira. It's Monday and she is super excited because it's her first day ever working as a junior software developer and she's working at Big Tech Co. So she turns up at the office where she's greeted by her product manager, Franco. Now, Franco looks a little stressed. He gives Kira a laptop and he says, log in, go onto Google Drive, and there should be a document that explains everything. Get set up. Then he disappears. So Kira turns on the laptop, signs in, and starts looking around in the Google Drive. She looks for new starter, new hire, new employee, orientation guide, first day at work guide, and she can't find anything. After hours of searching, she decides that she's going to send Franco a Slack message. So she says, sorry to bother you, but can you please point me in the right direction of the Google Doc that explains everything? Over an hour later, Franco responds, you're still not set up yet? It's here. And he links to a document called Document That Explains Everything 2007. Right, so she opens up the document and it's 600 pages long. There's no table of contents, there's no index, there are no headings. But she has a look through it and it looks like Big Tech Co. has a variety of repos. Some use Python, some use Ruby on Rails. Finally, buried on page 362, she finds this. So this looks kind of familiar. It looks like some terminal commands that she needs to run in order to get the repo. So she thinks, I can do this. She opens up terminal and she runs the first command. This happens. She gets this error. She's not entirely sure what this means. She doesn't want to bother Franco after his last response, so she decides to send a message to her senior software developer in the team, Felicity. Sorry to bother you, but I'm getting this error when I try to install the repo. Do you know what I need to do to fix this? Over an hour later, Felicity replies, you're still not set up yet? Your machine has Python 2 installed. You need to be on Python 3. Right. So Kira installs Python 3 and manages to get the repo. It's almost the end of the day, but she really wants to finish off this orientation checklist. So she decides that she's going to continue and run the next command on the checklist. Create database. And it returns a URL, username, and password, just like the document said. Great. But hang on a minute, something is up. What she has on her screen has her name in it, and it's also got some gibberish CS152. Kira's feeling a little bit nervous. This wasn't what was in the document. Maybe she's done something wrong. So not wanting to stray from the document, she decides that she's going to run the next command about seeding the database with the URL, username, and password that's in the document. After all, she doesn't know what seeding is, and she just wants to follow the document word for word to make sure that she doesn't make any mistakes. You have successfully seeded our database with test data. Great, success, she thinks. With that, she shuts down her laptop and heads home for the day. It's almost 6 p.m. by this point. An hour later, she gets a call from Felicity. Felicity is livid. "You just wiped our production database," she shouts. "Don't come back to the office tomorrow." So let's pause there. I'd like to have a look at what happened and how things could have gone a little bit differently. In doing so, I'll give you a few tips for writing tech documentation that may very well save your career or save the career of somebody else. So tip number 1, pick your document title carefully. If you remember, Kira had actually gone and searched for all the relevant terms, new hire, new starter, and she couldn't find the document because it was very unhelpfully called document that explains everything. Make your documents really easy to find. If they're not found, they won't be read. So when I say make them easy to find, I want you to think of your document like it's going to be indexed by a search engine, right? So make it SEO friendly. You should have a title that's really clear, really precise, and really accurate. So for example, how to remove columns from our database. Really, really clear as to what this document is about. And really easy to find as well. And when I say search engine friendly, I don't mean using clickbait titles. So having titles like 4 ways to remove columns from our database, the final one will shock you, is hilarious. But unless your developers are browsing your documentation like they're reading Cosmopolitan magazine on the toilet, this is probably not the way to go. Tip number 2, provide clear structure. So if you remember, that document that Kira was reading was 600 pages long, no index, no headings. That's really hard to follow. So you want to have an index or a table of contents or an outline, whatever it is that you call it. And you want to make sure that the headings are clickable. In other words, you can click on a heading and it'll take you to the relevant section. You want to also offer an introduction, particularly if your document's quite lengthy. So in this introduction, explain what the document is going to do, what it's going to tell you. Nobody likes reading a document that's pages and pages long and coming to the end and realizing that the document never actually answered their question and didn't give them what they were looking for. You can also mention pre-reading or prerequisite knowledge that's needed. And you can also, if it's quite long, you can summarize the document with a bit of a too long didn't read section, particularly if you know that your developer would rather be reading Cosmopolitan magazine on the toilet than reading the documentation. And if your document is really long, then you might want to consider breaking it up into different documents. So just like if you had a big piece of code that you will then extract out into modules and concerns, you might want to consider actually breaking apart your document into separate documents and then linking them in one document. And that's even easier than with code where sometimes you have to import files. So let's have a look at an example. This document has a really clear title, How to Run Database Migrations. Anyone searching for any sort of variation or combination of database migration will come across this document. On the right-hand side, we have an outline, which again, the headings are clickable. If you click on one of those, it'll take you to the relevant section. And then we've got an introduction with a too long didn't read. And it says, you need to run database migrations using our 0 downtime policy below if you are doing any of the following things. And it lists all the different types of migrations that you might be doing where this document is relevant. So you can have a quick skim through and say, well, actually, my migration has got nothing to do with those, so I don't actually need to read this document. At the bottom of the too long didn't read section, that last line, it says, not sure how our database is structured? We've got you covered with this quick start guide, and it actually links to another document. So this is where there is some prerequisite reading, but you might already know how the database is structured, so you don't actually need to stuff that into the document that's currently being read. We've also got the use of paragraphs and emojis. So I kind of like doing this because it breaks up the text a little bit and it keeps the reader engaged. So it's really important to kind of try and get rid of chunky text. We also have an example error. So you might get an error like a Postgres error, column does not exist. And I kind of like doing this because I often find that when I'm searching through our internal documentation, I'm actually looking for specific errors that have popped up and I want to find how to solve it. So it's really nice if you include the error in your document with the solution. Tip number 3, update regularly. So the guide that Kira found was dated 2007. That's 10 plus years where no one had bothered to update the documentation, and no one had bothered to mention that you need Python 3 on your machine. Just as undiscoverable documentation is useless, so too is outdated documentation. If you're able to, try and really encourage your team to integrate updating documentation as part of their standard practice. So where I work at Valiant, we actually have a pull request template. So anytime someone opens a pull request on GitHub, the description will automatically be populated with a template. And that includes a checklist of things that you need to tick to say whether you've done them or not. One of those checklist items is, have you written or updated any necessary documentation? So it acts as a really nice reminder to your developers to try and integrate writing and updating documentation as part of their workflow. Having said that, documentation does become outdated. So try and give a little bit of context by mentioning today's date. So you could say, for example, as of January 2019, the process for removing columns from our database is this. And when things change, which inevitably they will, if it's a small line like that, you can actually just strike it out in your document and say, update. As of September 2019, we've moved towards a strong migrations approach for removing database columns. So this is really nice in that interim period where people are still doing things the way they used to, and then all of a sudden they get an error and they're like, wait, what's going on here? So actually having the strike out there showing we've shifted from the old way to the new way is helpful. Finally, if you have outdated documentation and you come across it, then please update it. Don't leave it for the next developer to suffer through the same process that you went through just because you didn't update the documentation. If everyone does their part little by little, it makes the whole process much, much easier. So here's an example of just a history of edits to a documentation that's being made at my company. So I created a document about clearing the Cloudflare cache. I made some edits to it back in November 2019. My colleague Donna then says, thanks for writing this doc. I've moved the document to another folder. 2 months later, my manager makes some edits. He then moves it to another folder. 2 months after that, Donna makes some edits, and she enables the outline. So you can see from November through to the following March, everyone is constantly updating it. It's a living, breathing, evolving part of our workflow. And again, if everyone does just a little bit each time, it makes it so much easier for everyone. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. All you want to know is what happened at Big Tech Co. What was this drama all about? Well, if you remember, Kira ran the seeding script, and she ran the create database script, and it came up with these credentials that were a bit funny, and they were different from the ones in the actual document. And remember how she didn't know what seeding meant? Well, at Big Tech Co, seeding means that your database is wiped completely clean, it's fresh slate, and then it's populated with preset fake data for you to use and test. So obviously when she used the seeding command in conjunction with the production credentials, it wiped the entire production database and filled it with fake data. And before you think that this scenario is far-fetched, remember CS Career Throwaway 567? This is exactly what happened to them. So let's have a look at how that could have gone about a little differently. Tip number 4, make the most of code examples. So if you remember, the documentation that Kira was looking at didn't have any code formatting. It was a bit confusing. So First of all, format your code. I've seen junior developers in terminal type in run pip install our repo, right, with the word run, not realizing that that's not actually part of the command. Similarly, I've seen developers use the actual $, which is used usually to denote bash commands, but they'll actually type the $, into terminal. And that's not their fault. The documentation should be clear as to what is actually part of the command. So use your code formatting, your backticks, your curly braces, double curlies, whatever it is that your software uses. In fact, let's go one step better. Not just format the code, but explain what it does. So for example, run pip install big tech code repo in terminal, which will install our entire repository on your machine in the current folder you're in. Now, I know for most of you that this will seem like overkill, but remember this. It's the less experienced developers that benefit the most from really clear, detailed documents. And they're the people that you should really be writing documentation for. So if you can, make it as clear as you can and explain what it is that the code is doing. Okay, so this document had the actual production credentials in it, which is a big, big no-no. So you should never include your credentials, your secrets, any of that in documents. These should actually be stored in a password manager, like for example, 1Password. And the reason I say that is because in this day and age, it is so easy to actually go and share documents externally. In Google Drive, you can just go and get a shareable link and email it to somebody externally, and they have access to that document. So don't store your credentials in there. On top of that, it was obviously very confusing for Kira. So what should have happened was it should have said something along the lines of run the create database command in terminal, and it will generate the credentials for you, which will look something along the lines of, but be different to this. And then have actual dummy credentials. Don't put in the production ones. All right, let's go back to the beginning of the day. This is Felicity. It's Monday, and she is really grumpy. Her product manager, Franco, has a really big, important investor demo on tonight, and he only just asked her to do a final review of the test website that he's going to be demoing, which is meant to showcase their big, snazzy pricing tier feature. The problem is, Felicity's a Python developer, and this test website was written in Ruby on Rails. It was written by her ex-colleague Donald, who has, unfortunately, been fired from his job. So she vaguely remembers talking to Donald about this project, but she can't quite remember the specifics. So she decides to jump into the code base and have a look. She goes to the pricing tier model, okay? That's been created. There are two associations, one to users and one to accounts. That's really odd, Felicity thinks. Keep in mind, Big Tech Co is a B2B company, so they deal with other companies, which they consider accounts. They never deal with individual users. She doesn't understand why there is a user association here. So she decides, okay, that's fine. I'll have a look at Donald's pull requests. That will give me a little bit more idea of what's going on. So she goes to the first pull request that he had created. And it only has one comment, and it says, add pricing tier model and account association. Okay, that makes sense, she thinks. That's obvious. Like B2B, we deal with accounts. That's perfect. But then a month later, there's a second pull request that's been opened. This is the one that has now created that association between the pricing tier and the user. It's the weird one that she doesn't understand. But there's no description. All Donald has said is F says this is good to push. It doesn't make any sense. Why do they need that user association? Donald hasn't written any tests for his code, so Felicity doesn't know what the code is supposed to do. And F says this is good to push. Was that in reference to her, Felicity, or was it in reference to Franco, the product manager? She knows she spoke to Donald about this, but she can't quite remember what was said. Felicity's really overwhelmed. She has a lot of work today, and she has to onboard the new hire, Kira, who's asking all these questions. She doesn't want to read through the entire code base, so she decides that she's going to send Franco a Slack message. She says, "Hi, I'm looking at Donald's work on the pricing tier project, and it's got an association between the user and the pricing tier. Weird. As well as the account and the pricing tier. Do you know why?" About an hour later, Franco replies, "Busy prepping for conference, read the spec." What spec? She wonders. She doesn't see a spec. There's no spec on the pull request. She can't find it in Google Drive. She's about to respond when suddenly production goes down because of something the new girl Kira did. It's almost 7 p.m. by this point. So Felicity decides to do a global Control F, and she decides to remove all references to the association between the user and the pricing tier. Because again, Big Tech Co is B2B. It should really be with the account, not with the user, she thinks. Success. The build passes. No tests. So, having done that, she pushes her code and she texts Franco telling him he's good to go for his big demo tonight. Then she gets back to work trying to restore production. A few hours later, she receives a call from Franco. He is livid. "You just screwed up my big demo," he shouts. "Don't come back to the office tomorrow." Quite a day at Big Tech Co. All right, so let's talk about what happened, just for a little bit of context. So, as I've said, Big Tech Co is B2B. They have a customer, which is an account, and it's called Big Bank, right? So Franco had originally requested that the pricing tier be associated with the Big Bank account, which is exactly what Donald did in that first pull request. But then Franco spoke to Big Bank and realized they actually have a bunch of different staff. Right? They have lots of different staff. And some of those staff want to be on the paid pricing tier, and some want to be on the free pricing tier. So that's why he told Donald that he'd need to move the pricing tier association and move it over to the users instead, which is exactly what Donald did a month later with that second pull request. But Donald didn't actually remove the association with the original association with the account, because by that point he'd gotten fired. So we now have those two associations that Felicity found. To make matters worse, Donald also didn't actually bother assigning any of the users their pricing tiers, because he was thinking that's a data issue. Franco knows which of the users are paid and which ones are free. I don't. It's not my problem. So now none of the users actually have any pricing tiers attached to them. Right, so how could this have been avoided? Tip number 5, refine your commit messages and your PRs. So we saw some rather unhelpful commit messages and some unhelpful PR descriptions. So the first thing I would say is write really short, clear commit messages. In fact, GitHub actually recommends keeping your commit subject line to below 50 characters. When I say short, this is not what I mean. This is also not what I mean. Or this. Or my favorite of all, this. It's the middle finger in case you can't see it. Right, so short, clear commit messages that actually relate to what has been done. So keep in mind that you can do selective committing, and you should. So for example, just commit lines 3 to 6 and lines 12 to 15 under one commit that summarizes those lines, rather than committing a file that's thousands of lines long that all relate to different things. Okay, so while you might have short commit messages, you should probably have detailed pull request descriptions. So like I mentioned, at Valiant, we actually have that pull request template that gets automatically populated. And it is a combination of a description of what you've done in that pull request, as well as the checklist of things that you need to do. And if you're thinking that there is no way in hell that your company would waste time filling out pull request templates and letting their developers do that, then I would encourage you to think of the beer truck factor. And that is a test to describe essentially the number of people in your team that need to be hit by a beer truck before you lose significant amounts of your knowledge base or a project stalls completely. So for example, if you think of that 10x engineer colleague that you have, and if they suddenly got taken out of action, how much of that knowledge in his or her head has now been lost forever? Rather than relying on individuals to carry around pockets of siloed information in their heads, companies really should be encouraging their staff to institutionalize the knowledge and therefore mitigate the risk by actually having it in documentation. Right, so let's have a look at what Donald probably should have done when he was opening his PR. So this is an example of a pull request template. So first of all, there's a description. This would have been really helpful for Felicity if the pull request had actually explained that previously there was an association between the account and the pricing tier. But after speaking to Big Bank, Franco realized that they actually needed it to be on the user, not the account. So this would have told her what was being changed and why it was being changed. We don't have any pre-deployment checks for this one, but we do have a deployment check, and it is to wait until Franco's demo is done before deploying this. Sometimes this is quite important because you don't want your colleagues to accidentally deploy your work before it's ready to go out, so you should make a note of it here. You can also list your post-deployment checks as well if you know that you're going to come back to the PR after it's been merged and closed. If you're not going to, then this should be better stored maybe in a ticket or in the product spec. So this should really list all those things that need to be done after the deployment is made. So in this case, Donald should have mentioned that somebody needed to do the data migration and apply the pricing tiers to the users, and also to remove the association between the pricing tier and the account. It should have been recorded here. QA, it's also really handy to say who's done the QA and where, whether it's locally on a review app or in Postman. And also have a miscellaneous checklist at the bottom of things like whether tests have been written and whether the documentation has been written or updated. Tip number 6, comment the code where necessary. Okay, so code comments are a little bit tricky. It's hard to find that balance between commenting too little and commenting too much. You probably want to think of commenting the code when it needs some context. So for example, something has not been done for a specific reason, or something has been done and it's kind of out of the ordinary. So people would look at that and think, well, that's a little bit weird. Why did they do it that way? That's when code comments are super handy. I've sometimes seen repos just littered with to-dos, and it's to-do refactor, to-do refactor, to-do refactor, and guess what? No one ever comes back to do the refactor. So try to avoid that. If you really are going to be leaving to-do comments, then I would say they should be for tasks that are going to be done in a relatively short period of time. So maybe mention who is to do what and why they're doing it, possibly even when, but it should be within a short period of time. Don't forget, don't just comment your code because you can or because your code is really complicated. If your code is unnecessarily complicated and you could refactor it and make it better, then do it. Comments shouldn't be a crutch for bad code. So you want to be using your comments to, again, fill in that context, but not just, oh, I've written thousands of lines of code and no one's ever going to understand it, so I'm going to leave a comment at the top because I can't be bothered to refactor. All right, so let's have a look at a few examples. So we have a to-do here, and it says, to-do Donald, delete the accounts association below after Franco finishes data migration from accounts to users. If Donald had left this comment in the code base, then Felicity would have realized that this was necessary after the data migration had been done. And she would have realized that that hadn't been done, and so that's what she would have needed to do. So that's an example where a to-do can be handy if it's meant to be done within a short period of time. We have another comment here. It says default tier is free user. When you look at that class method, it's pretty clear. It's self.default and it's find by name being free user. This is an example of where someone's just commenting for the sake of it. It's pretty clear from the code, so I would argue that that comment is not necessary. And finally, we've got a to-do here, to-do Franco, set active to true on pricing tiers when they're ready to go live. So in essence, this is a feature flag. And so it's reminding Franco that he needs to actually turn on the attribute, the active to true, in order for the pricing tier to go live. The thing is, Franco's a product manager and he doesn't actually look through the code base. So again, this is not the most appropriate place for that sort of comment. That should really be in a ticket or the product spec. Here's an example of a code comment from one of my colleagues. And this is an example of where you can't do something or you haven't done something and you want to tell people why. You want to tell them that they thought about this. So it says, we can't spec the context below as we have a callback to set nil values to onboarding. And then he's actually written what the spec would have been. And this is really important, particularly if you work in a team similar to mine, where if you see that there's a missing spec, you'll try and write that spec, even if you didn't write the original code. So clearly, my colleague has said, hey, don't waste your time doing that. It doesn't work. I've tried it, I've thought about it, and this is why it doesn't work. Here's another example from a different colleague of mine. I really like this one. It says, hey, where did the record type settle record type method go? We removed this for performance issues. If you're looking for a specific record type, please use the buck helper. And I really like this one because I was actually looking for that method. And I was thinking, am I going crazy? I swear I just saw this a couple of days ago. Where has it gone? And then I saw his comment. So a classic example of that transition sort of comment of things have changed. I'm letting you know now that this is what's changed and why. All right, tip number 7, write comprehensive specs. So Felicity was really stuck because Donald hadn't written any specs to help her figure out what the code was supposed to do. So specs not only help you determine what the code is meant to do, but it will also hopefully act as a bit of a warning to you when you do change that code and you change it to something that it's not meant to do. Like, for example, when you do a global control F and decide to delete an association. So thinking about those context blocks and saying, for example, okay, what happens when an account doesn't have a user? Maybe big bank suddenly loses all its staff. There are no users. What happens then? What about when an account has a user, but the user hasn't chosen a pricing tier? Maybe they're in the middle of onboarding. What happens when an account has a user and they're on a paid tier, and what happens when they're on a free tier? So if Donald had actually done this and written those specs, Felicity would have realized, oh, I get it. An account actually has users, and that pricing tier is meant to apply to those users, not to the account. Let's rewind back to the start of the day one last time. This is Franco. It's Monday, and he's really, really anxious. He's a product manager at Big Tech Co, and tonight he's meant to be demoing at this huge industry conference, their snazzy new pricing tier feature that the team has been working on. This pricing tier feature restricts what customers can do based on whether they're on the paid tier or the free tier. The free tier, they're pretty limited. The paid tier, they have a lot of really cool functionality. This is meant to make the company lots and lots of money, so he's really got to shine at this investor demo. Right before his big presentation, Felicity sends him a text message telling him that he's good to go. So Franco already has a demo account with a demo user set up. He remembers asking the engineering team to make sure that the paid pricing tier had been applied to his user, but he wants to double check. He doesn't quite trust them, particularly that Donald guy. So he decides to call pricingtier.all. There's only one. This is ridiculous. Turns out there is no paid user pricing tier. Franco is furious. This was the engineering team's job. How could they forget to add the actual paid pricing tier? Franco goes back to check the feature spec. What feature spec? He didn't write a feature spec, but he did write a Jira ticket for them. And it says, add pricing tier model. Will probably be 2 tiers, free user and paid user. Free doesn't let them do anything, paid can do everything. Don't make them live yet. Names might change, we'll revert back to you. And then he's clearly said, add pricing tier association to account, and then update, add it to user. There is a message from Donald at the bottom of this, and it says, don't forget what we discussed today about the status. Well, guess what? Franco can't remember what they discussed about the status. This was a long time ago. Thank goodness Franco knows a little bit of Rails. So he jumps into console, and he decides to run this command. He's going to create a pricing tier called paid user, and he's going to give it the readability, the updatability, and the destroyability. Cool. And now we have a pricing tier called paid user. Excellent. Success. So he then adds that association to his demo account and feels like he's ready to go. At around 7 p.m., he goes on stage, logs into his demo account as his demo user, and oh, that is awkward. His dashboard shows that he's on the free tier dashboard. He's not able to access any of the paid features, none of the amazing functionality that they've been working so hard on, none of those whiz-bang features that he came up with. He can't do anything. He's on the free tier. Franco is mortified. It's almost 10 p.m. A few hours later, he receives a phone call from the CEO of the company. He is livid. You just screwed up our chance to get investor money, he shouts. Don't come back to the office tomorrow. I was really hoping everyone would say that with me, but it's all right, next time. All right, so let's talk about what happened. So remember that really cryptic comment from Donald, don't forget what we discussed about the status? Yeah, well, what he actually meant was there was a feature flag, the active true, on the pricing tier. So because Franco's ticket had said, don't make them live yet, Donald had been like, all right, well, fine, we have a free one, which is active, but for anything else, I'll set the default to be false. And guess what? Franco had no idea, right? So when he created his pricing tier, he didn't know that he was meant to set the feature flag active to be true. So we all know that there was no product spec, but how could we have improved the ticket? You want to write with precision and detail in your tickets or your product specs, whatever it is, that tells people what they're meant to do. So start by saying who is to do what, by when, and why, and how are they going to do it. The how is maybe a little bit less important because you might want to give your engineering team the creativity to figure that out. But it's really important to be clear about the 4 W's. So for example, could have been, at Donald Troll will create 2 pricing tiers today, one called free user and one called paid user. So clearly it's saying Donald is going to create the pricing tiers, and there are 2 of them, and these are their names. This bit about free doesn't let them do anything, paid can do everything. What is anything? What is everything? Be much more specific about tasks, so list the actual attributes. For example, the paid tier lets you read, create, update, and destroy. The free tier only lets you read, for example. Keep a paper trail of all requests. So this whole don't forget what we discussed today about the status, that is really unhelpful. It's really common with engineering teams for a colleague to come up in the middle of a project and say, hey, you know that association you're doing? We don't want that. Or you need to remove this column, or we've changed something, we're going to do this instead. If that's the case, make sure that you note it down in a document, preferably one that is accessible by all. You really want to keep that paper trail of who requested what. Donald's comment instead should have been something like this. I spoke to @Franco PM about this today on the 1st of May 2019. He told me that as we have now finished the investor demo, we should turn off all the pricing tiers. I've done this, don't forget to reactivate this when we go live by setting the Boolean active flag to true. If this comment had been left, then Franco would have actually looked at it and been like, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. I actually need to turn on the feature flag. So this is an example of what happened at work a couple of months ago. So we received an error through Sentry about a really minor bug. And a colleague and I had a discussion about it. And we decided that we weren't actually going to fix it for a variety of reasons. And he said to me, do you want me to update the ticket or do you want to? Which is the right mentality to have. Because the ticket had been assigned to me, I then wrote a comment. And I said, spoke to @James about this. We've decided not to fix the bug for the following reasons. And I detailed the reasons. Our manager was actually away at the time, but if he'd come back and been like, oh, I wonder why they didn't fix that bug, he would have been able to see from the ticket straight away that we had had a discussion and why we hadn't fixed it. You'll also note that I've actually tagged James in this comment, and that's to confirm that we both agreed on this course of action, but to also give him an opportunity to read through what I've written, and he may very well say, I took a look and that's actually not quite what I meant. And he would have the opportunity to respond, or I could edit the ticket. So really handy to keep that paper trail live. So in conclusion, don't forget to pick your title carefully. Use something that can be, that is considered SEO friendly, that can be found. Secondly, provide a really clear structure, headings, subheadings, table of contents. Try and break up the text as well. Don't forget to update your documents regularly and try and incorporate it into your workflow and your process. Make the most of code examples, so really use that formatting, and don't forget to try and write descriptions of what the code's actually doing, and think about that junior developer that you once were and how helpful this document would be to them. Keep your commit messages nice and short, nice and clear, and related to what is actually being committed, but keep your PR descriptions nice and detailed. Don't forget, if necessary, you can comment the code and write comprehensive specs. So you want to try and cover all the different scenarios so that people will actually know what the code is supposed to do. Finally, in your product specs, in your tickets, whatever it is, cover the 4 Ws of who is doing what, why they're doing it, when they're doing it by, and also how they're doing it. I'd like to take this opportunity to again thank RubyConf Australia for having me. It's been such an honor and a pleasure. I would also like to make a shout out to both Nadia and Tekken from last year's conference. Their presentations really inspired the format of this one, and I would highly recommend that you take a look and go through their presentations from 2019. Finally, you can find me on Twitter at Carmen Chung. I'll be tweeting out a sample PR template that you are more than welcome to use, as well as a blog post recapping what I've said today. Thank you very much.